to Innsmouth, stranger.
Ladies and gentlemen, big hand please for our guest of honour, Mr. Charles Stross. So perhaps we can begin at the beginning and first talk about how you got into weird fiction, first of all, and what was your first exposure to Lovecraft in particular?
I was fairly late to Lovecraft, and to tell the truth, I don't actually rate him very highly as a writer. This is just me. The problem with Lovecraft is that he permeates everything to do with weird fiction and horror. You can't really avoid him. I'm trying to think of any other genre that has an individual author who's this influential. I suppose you could probably argue that Jane Austen was just as influential in romance. In that it's very hard to write something in that field without tangentially dealing with material that the author originally tackled. But I suppose I came to Lovecraft more through his science fiction than his weird fiction, specifically At the Mountains of Madness, which is realistically, it's science fiction rather than horror as such. It's definitely weird, it's definitely part of Lovecraft's mythos. But what he did that was noteworthy in science fiction, for which he deserves to be remembered, is early science fiction, the Gernsbackian tradition, was very much about a sense of wonder. The cosmos is vast, it's amazing, it's huge. We can go into space and we can have adventures there and we can find interesting alien exotic species and have sex with them, if you're James T. Kirk. Or murder them, if you're pretty much anybody else. Lovecraft's take was more along the lines of the universe is vast, it is enormous, it is ancient, it is ineffable, it is unknowable, it absolutely dwarfs us like ants beneath the feet of elephants. Oh woe, oh misery, we're insignificant. He came up with a sense of cosmic dread. Now actually, I have a hypothesis about where Lovecraft got his sense of cosmic dread from. This is the science fictional take on Lovecraft rather than the horror, fantasy or weird tales take. But Lovecraft, when he was a kid, wanted to be an astronomer. Lovecraft also pretty much had a nervous breakdown in his early teens. And the interesting thing is, when he was around and wanting to become an astronomer, Lovecraft's period was from roughly the 1890s through to 1937, when he died prematurely of cancer. Now, before Lovecraft's life, before about 1830 in fact, astronomy was basically dominated by the use of telescopes and the naked human Mark I eyeball. If you have 20/20 vision and look at the skies, I'm told, because I really don't, you should be able to see 500 to 1,000 objects with a naked eye, just about, given clear skies, good weather and no pollution. With a telescope, this increases to maybe 100,000 visible objects. Then, from about 1840 onwards, we saw the first attempts at using photographic emulsion plates to capture the sky. And an interesting thing about a photographic plate is you can do a long exposure that captures more photons from the same light source. You can use mechanisms that keep the telescope stabilized as the Earth's surface is spinning under it, so that it points at the same area of sky for minutes or hours during the exposure. By about 1890, the new field of astrophotometry had drastically increased the number of observable stars to over 1 million. It had also clarified the existence of these vague blurs, the stellar nebulae, they were called, because like the fixed stars, they stayed in place in the heavens rather than revolving around the sun, but they were just basically cloudy blurs. The stellar nebulae today we know to be either dust and gas clouds or, more interestingly, other galaxies a long way away. Now, it wasn't clear that they were galaxies back then, but it was clear that they had stars within them and they were a very long way away. So, early Lovecraft, the universe had maybe 1 million stars. Also, early Lovecraft, theories of how old the Earth was and how old the Sun was were somewhat at odds. Nobody was quite sure how old anything was because in the absence of a discovery of radioactivity, we had no real way of dating isotopes in rock deposits. We were dependent on studying layers of sedimentation, and we didn't really have a theory for how that worked for why the sun was bright. The best explanation of the 19th century was that of Lord Kelvin, who theorized that firstly, the sun emitted heat due to energy released from its own gravitational collapse, and this was augmented by infalling comets and other debris. But by his calculation, the sun was very unlikely to be more than 100 million years old, and vanishingly unlikely to be more than 500 million years old. So, to Lord Kelvin, the solar system was young. It was probably about 100 million years old. The dinosaurs had gone extinct perhaps 2 or 3 million years ago. Then they spoke of antediluvian lizards, and when we hear modern-day fundamentalist preachers rabbiting on about Jesus riding tyrannosaurs, this is harking back to a 19th century understanding of the age of the universe. Now, we fast forward to around 1890, we have Marie Curie and the discovery of radioactivity, and not long thereafter, physics got weird. Not only did physics get weird, astronomy got weird. We had the beginnings of astrophysics, we had general relativity and special relativity, and subsequently, in the 19-teens and early 20s, the discovery of the red shift and of Hubble's constant, the cosmological expansion. The universe is not static and endless and the same in all directions. It's expanding from a point, or what appears to be a point, which is the origin of space-time. And by about 1930, they've worked out that the universe was roughly 10 to 20,000 million years old. They had also, by studying photographic plates with long exposures and much better reflector telescopes, worked out that there were at least 1 million other galaxies, and that our galaxy had at least 100 million stars in it, possibly 1 billion. We actually now know that this is a really lowball figure. There's probably more than 400 billion stars in our galaxy, and probably more than 100 billion galaxies beyond it. Although the age of the universe is reasonably constant at about 13.5 to 14 billion years. The thing is, the universe was vastly larger at the time of Lovecraft's death than it had been at the time of his birth. How much larger? Well, it had grown exponentially by multiple orders of magnitude. In fact, the universe was, our understanding of the scale of the universe, pretty much doubled in size every 2 years during his life. The only experience we've got to measure this against is the increase in computing power since 1970. If you take a 1970 microprocessor like the Intel 4004 and compare it to a modern day one with billions of transistors in it, it's that order of difference between the universe as Lovecraft understood it when he died and the universe as it had been understood in his childhood. And if you want a sense of cosmological dread, I'd like you to imagine that everything you know about reality is getting bigger, faster, like that.
Yeah, so I think I'm safe in saying that your first sort of dipping your toe into the water of Lovecraftian fiction was the story Cold War, is that right?
Yeah.
And that sort of, what was the thinking behind that? Because it's quite different to a lot of Lovecraftian fiction.
Okay,
yeah.
A Cold War is a counterfactual novelette that takes as its starting point the assumption. How many people here have read At the Mountains of Madness? Great. I'd like you to imagine that At the Mountains of Madness is a true and accurate factual account of the Pabodie expedition to the Antarctic. A Cold War asks what would have happened afterwards. There are, of course, going to be various other great power Antarctic expeditions because there is a gold rush to find the relics and technologies and remaining artifacts of the Elder Ones. And this persists, and we have the Nazi expedition and the Second American expedition, and things recomplicate, and after the Second World War, various Nazi relics are dragged back to Russia or collected by the West in Operation Paperclip. So Russia ends up with custody of Cthulhu. Now, to some extent, I was riffing off a very, very short story that Bruce Sterling wrote in the late 1980s. If I remember correctly, it's titled The Sublime and the Ineffable. And it's two arms reduction negotiators, an American and a Soviet one, discussing how they got rid of the Lovecraftian horrors that were going to end civilization, that both superpowers were pointing at each other. It was a metaphor for nuclear weapons, which are really, really difficult to appreciate the sheer existential horror of if you didn't grow up during the Cold War. I turned 60 this year. I was 25 when the Berlin Wall came down. And I think I probably have mild PTSD from fear of nuclear apocalypse under Thatcher and Reagan. Probably quite a few of you here remember that as well.
Yep.
I began writing a Cold War in 1992, partly as a reaction to the Bruce Sterling story and partly building on At the Mountains of Madness, as an attempt to encapsulate and deal with the sense of existential dread of nuclear war from the 1980s. It then sat on the shelf for several years before I finished it and sold it in 1998 to the Scottish science fiction magazine Spectrum SF. The point of a Cold War is the Soviets and the United States assimilate Lovecraftian horrors and turn them into the arsenal of Cold War deterrence. And of course, deterrence fails in due course due to shitbaggery on the part of people like Colonel Oliver North, who features in the story. And there is a Third World War, and at the end of it, we have a traumatized CIA officer sitting on the edge of a plateau on a dead world, wondering what the hell just happened to him, and is he in fact still alive? Or just existing in the imagination of an elder god? Because of course, World War III has happened, his wife and kids were left behind when he was dragged away to a bunker along with various other essential personnel. And it's a really, really, really grim story because I was trying to put, at the time I was writing, we had this fad for things like Cthulhu bedroom slippers. Remember them? And I wanted to put the fear and utter dread of existential annihilation back into it. And the easiest way to do that was to make nuclear weapons a metaphor for the mythos rather than the other way around.
Nice.
And do you think now, I mean, that nuclear threat is still with us, of course, unfortunately, but do you think the new threat is now seen as AI in particular? That's getting a lot of press at the moment.
I could rabbit on about the AI threat, in scare quotes, for ages, but I'm not going to. Let's just say it's bullshit. I work in the IT sector. I have a computer science degree. I've seen multiple speculation-fueled, venture capital-ridden bubbles in tech for the past 30 years, and this is just another one. It's the successor to cryptocurrency and blockchain, and before that to the dot-com bubble. And venture capitalists in Silicon Valley can't find a big enough mattress to stuff all their money under, so they throw it into some new area, and then they try and convince ordinary people to invest their life savings in it so they can make a return on their investment. And it's bullshit, all the way. What we're seeing marketed as AI, for the most part, is spicy autocomplete. It's Clippy on steroids. It's not actually intelligent. I have opinions about AI. Speaking as somebody who's written novels about the singularity, 25 years ago since I began writing Accelerando, a novel about the singularity. No, I'm a skeptic.
So after Cold War, you went into doing the laundry files.
Yeah.
You know, to tell us a little bit about how that came about, because that's essentially, in a nutshell, bureaucracy versus the Cthulhu mythos.
Okay, it happened by accident.
Nice.
In 1996 to 2000, I was working for a .com. I was the first programmer they hired as a contractor, and in fact, I left shortly after the IPO, and that company doesn't exist anymore because it's a division of MasterCard. They won, you know, you beat the boss monster, roll the end credits. Now here's your business suit and your pension plan. Anyway, I left before it turned that way. I was avoiding having a nervous breakdown because it was the .com1 era, and I was writing and maintaining software for running credit card transactions past banks at one end and web servers at the other, because nobody figured out how to do that much before. Think PayPal's idiot twin. And the volume of transactions my software was having to process was growing by 30% compounded monthly. 30% per month compound growth for 9 consecutive months. I was the only developer responsible for this stuff. We couldn't hire and train minions fast enough. Charlie was on the edge of a nervous breakdown. So I dealt with that in 2 ways. Firstly, by writing a really weird short story called Lobsters, set in the near future with things working towards a singularity, which became the germ of a novel called Accelerando, which follows 3 generations of a really, really dysfunctional post-human family, all the way through a hard take-off AI singularity and out the other end. And it's, you've heard the Torment Nexus term. An awful lot of Silicon Valley, glassy-eyed AI boosters and enthusiasts seem to think of it as a utopia, but it's not, it's the Torment Nexus. If you read Accelerando now, just bear in mind it's my Torment Nexus novel. But at the same time, I needed to write something a bit more therapeutic. A couple of years on a space opera that eventually came out in 2003. And I wanted to write more along the lines of the Cold War, but it was just, frankly, far too grim. It's slit your throats grim, that novelette. So I decided to write something a little bit more amusing. And what could you do? Well, if we're dealing with spy agencies trying to fend off Lovecraftian horrors that threaten reality, they're going to be government bureaucracies. And you can get enormous mileage from fish-out-of-water humour, where you have a protagonist who is basically competent and well-meaning, but is dumped into an utterly inappropriate environment. In this case, a .com hacker nerd, Bob Howard, who tends to wear sandals and cargo pants to work, and does obscure things with network cables and switches, who has been dumped into a British secret government agency straight out of a Len Dayton novel. Which is to say, somewhat seedy, somewhat sleazy. Your modern angle on this would be Slow Horses, with added tentacles. And I wrote this short novel, and things gradually escalated through the short novel, and I think some of you have probably have read The Atrocity Archives.
Yeah.
And the Atrocity Archives as a book consists of a short novel, The Atrocity Archive, no S at the end, and a novella, The Concrete Jungle. It had an odd publication history. It was originally, the first novel was published, serialised in Spectrum SF, the Scottish SF magazine, that conveniently went bust shortly thereafter. And then it kind of moulded there. My agent actually rejected it. The first time I sent it to her, because she'd successfully sold 2 space operas for me, she said, "This is great, but there's no way I can sell this. It's too weird, it's too cross-genre. It's humour, and it's horror, and it's a British spy thriller. I mean, nobody in their right mind is going to publish this."
Find someone not in their right mind.
Yeah. Anyway, around that time, Golden Griffin, who was sort of a spin-off of Arkham House in the States, Lovecraftian press, got in touch and said, "Can you write us a novella?" And I was kind of a bit busy at the time because, as I said, selling space operas, and I just landed a contract for what became the Merchant Princes series with Tor. No, but I've got this short novel. Maybe you could publish this. So I sent it to Marty, the editor of Golden Griffin, and he said, "This is really great, I want to publish it, but it's too short. Can you maybe write an extra novella to go in the book with it?" Okay, well, at least I was getting a book for the price of writing a novella. So I wrote The Concrete Jungle, and in due course, they published this odd hardcover from a small press in the United States, and much to everybody's utter shock and bamboozlement, the novella got shortlisted for the Hugo Award and then won. I mean, in what universe does a novella written as padding for a book from a small press win a Hugo Award? So that happened, and of course, can you write us another book? So I wrote the next book in the series, The Jennifer Morgue, for Golden Griffin. And when I say the Atrocity Archive was basically the Len Dayton meets hacker vibe book, this one was Bob Howard, the hacker, is parachuted into a James Bond movie against his will. He is definitely not suited to be James Bond. And in fact, as it turns out, this is a huge spoiler for the book, Bob is not in fact James Bond. Bob is, however, a very other important supporting character in a James Bond movie. Which one I'll let you figure out if you haven't read it already. And then things kind of snowballed and we sold the rights to the third book to my main American publisher, Ace, which is part of Penguin Random House. And let's just say things gained momentum of their own accord, and for my sins, my next job is to do the rewrite and final draft of the Regicide Report, the last book in the series. Now, I should add, the Atrocity Archive was written as a short standalone. Then they wanted a sequel, and I was thinking in terms of a trilogy. This is going to be book 13, about the assassination of Queen Elizabeth II in 2015 at the orders of Nyarlathotep. It goes wrong.
You mentioned genres there in passing. I mean, is there more and more pressure on creators of all types these days? I mean, I see it particularly in music as well, you are that genre, that's it. How dare you come out of that genre? How dare you even, if you mix things, that's not encouraged because which part of the bookshop do we put it in, and so on.
Yes, and the reason for it is we are artisanal producers and sole traders producing content that gets productized and distributed through large corporations. Now, the thing about the large corporation is they like consistency. They're a sausage machine. We are, if you like, producing artisanal individual sausages, and they're producing the string of sausages that goes to the supermarket on a production line. Now, the easiest thing... No, let me back up a moment. Editors these days don't really edit. What they do is they acquire books and they manage. They're massively overworked. If they do actually edit and provide feedback, and they're usually pretty good at it, it's what they do in their spare time as unpaid overtime. What they're actually paid for is meetings with marketing people who they answer to because they're responsible for generating revenue consistently. And the marketing people, the easiest way to convince a marketing person to sell something is to say it's just like the last one, only slightly different. You know how you sold the last one? Sell this one the same. We have a secondary problem, which is readers don't really like this. Readers don't actually want something that's just like the last, only slightly different. What they want is something that makes them feel the same way they felt when they read the first one. The shock of the new. So, if you sell a sequel in a trilogy or a series, usually the sales of book 2 and onwards will diminish by 10 to 20% from book to book, every time. In a particularly steep dive, they drop by 40 to 50% from book to book. This is why you see so many trilogies with only 2 books ever published. The publisher only buys the first 2 books, and if the second book does not sell comparably to the first, they cut it off at the knees ruthlessly, because they're not going to make a profit on book 3. Authors who are not wise to this get caught by it, and in some cases they've already written book 3, so they end up self-publishing it. But it's a brutal industry, it is a real killer. If you get a series going where each successive book sells just as many copies as the one before it, this is a wild commercial success in publishing. I managed to do that with the Merchant Prince's books, and for a while I was doing even better with The Laundry, when sales were growing by 10% from book to book. Unfortunately, I'm primarily sold in the United States, and my main publisher, Ace, is part of Penguin, who merged with Random House in 2012, 2013, and the Random Penguin merger was a smoking dumpster fire with a plane crash on top. Random House was bigger than Penguin, about a 3-to-2 ratio. So the individual imprints, the executives running them, Random House's imprints, the managers had more momentum behind them. There was a game of musical chairs at board level, and the Penguin executives took early retirement or were sacked. And things rippled down slowly as the back-end royalty payment databases got merged, which took ages, until a few years later there was a shockwave, and I went through 3 editors in 1 year and ended up with the editorial assistant, now promoted to senior editor. And then my editor was selling me to Ace on 2 book deals, a science fiction novel and a laundry novel. 1 a year, 2 books at a time. And we got some interesting feedback in 2015. We really like this pitch for a space opera and we'll double your advance for it, but we can't buy any more laundry novels. Why is that? Well, we had to do this exercise in stack ranking of urban fantasy, which apparently I'm classified as, and The Laundry Files is not commercial. This was a series where the past couple of books had been hitting the USA Today bestseller charts. How's a series like this not commercial? Well, I'll explain. Business decisions. MBAs in the boardroom. They realise we have too many urban fantasy series, so let's rank them and cut off the bottom 50%, the ones that are dead weight. So, how are we going to rank them? Well, we need something that we can measure. Let's measure their 4th quarter sales. 4 quarters of a year. Now, books in hardcover are sold on sale, well, they get sent out to bookshops on credit and must be either returned or paid for in full 90 days later. That's at the end of the same quarter. The Laundry Files were published at the very beginning of the 3rd quarter. Some people are beginning to get it, yes. So I had a series that was going bestseller in the 3rd quarter. Sales are dead in the 4th quarter. And it's the 4th quarter that they ranked everything on. So, okay, this was Penguin Random House's loss, but it explains why I'm not published by Penguin Random House anymore. I'm published by Tor in the US. Tor knew a good thing when they saw it. But that did kind of disrupt the sales growth momentum I had going.
It's like you mentioned earlier that the Laundry Files, like you started off and you did Dayton and then obviously Fleming. Without spoilering the hell out of everything, what is the most bonkers thing you've lampooned? Because you tend to lampoon a lot of different things throughout the series.
Well, the first 4 I did were basically British spy thriller writers. Len Dayton, not so much Ian Fleming as what the Broccoli franchise did with his stuff after he died. Then I did a Anthony Price novels. Anyone remember Anthony Price, the Cold War spy thriller author who tended to have historians in leading role? That was the 3rd one. And the 4th one was a Modesty Blaze novel. But then I got bored doing the spy thriller writers because I get bored easily and mess around. I probably have more than a touch of ADHD. So I then switched to lampooning urban fantasy genres. The 5th novel, The Rhesus Chart. Okay, I had to do lunch with my editor and explain why the next science fiction novel was going to be 2 years late. I'd bitten off more than I can chew. And this went down like a lead balloon over dinner. But there is this laundry novel that I need to write, I told her. And she just fixed me with a gimlet glare. Pitch it to me. Okay, here's the pitch for the 5th laundry novel. Don't be silly, Bob, said Mo. Everybody knows vampires don't exist. And Ginger Buchanan, my absolutely terrifying editor, she was pretty much Robert Heinlein's last editor, just fixed me with a gimlet stare and said, get your agent to write me a deal memo. A deal memo is a piece of paper which says it is understood that novel X will not be delivered, instead we're taking novel Y. And that's the shortest pitch and the fastest acceptance I've ever had. So, after doing Charlie's take on vampires, and everybody knows vampires don't exist, the climax of the book is a boss battle between 3 different types of vampire. After that, where do you go from there? Well, I got bitten by an attack novel subsequently and ended up doing superheroes. Or maybe it's a middle-aged, very sensible female civil servant's midlife crisis novel. Or both. and a conspiracy by the Association of Chief Police Constables to brainwash the entire UK using magic. Well, you know, they want a nice law-abiding population. Isn't that a supervillain sort of thing to do? So then, as I said, I was getting bored. Having done that, I think Echoid came along shortly after that, and that was my unicorn novella, which I'm told has ruined My Little Pony forever.
It needed ruining, to be fair.
Yeah. But however that may be, the third of that series of novels, The Nightmare Stacks, was I decided to do elves. And combined arms warfare elves at that. And also, I have a bee in my bonnet about a trope in urban fantasy called the Masquerade. Anybody here not know what the Masquerade is? There's a general consensus in any urban fantasy setting that there is a council of high mages, or mages, vampires and wills, oh my, who are determined to suppress all news of magic or the paranormal from coming to the attention of the ordinary humans, lest they be witch hunts and all sorts of abominations happening. So the Masquerade is to be maintained at all costs. Everything is to be swept under the rug. If you're familiar with the ending of Men in Black, that's sort of how it goes. I decided, what happens when the Masquerade finally shatters? And it's not easy to conceal the effects of an armoured division rampaging through Yorkshire. So, book 8, the book after that, opens with Bob, our protagonist, forced to wear a suit and sit being grilled under spotlights in a BBC studio on Newsnight, being interrogated about why the laundry lost Leeds by Jeremy Paxman. And of course, once something like the laundry comes to the attention of the government will do what the government always does with part of the civil service, which is large, unaccountable, has a lot of assets, is perceived as being insufficiently free market oriented. Privatisation. And the original plan for the Delirium Brief was it was going to be a satire about privatisation of government assets. And of course, the lead bidder for the services provided via the laundry to the British government would, of course, be the cultists. You know where this is going. And then the Brexit referendum happened, and I had to do a rewrite. Because everything I'd written in that draft was insufficiently mad. So at the end of the book, we have a situation where there has been a very British coup d'etat. Well, okay, half the cabinet have been eaten by extraterrestrial parasites, and the government is taken over by a newly elected MP. Think in terms of Alan Bastard, only you can't see his face. Fabian Everyman, the living avatar of the Black Pharaoh, Niall Afatep, leader of the ruling party, who ushers in a new government in an age of strength and stability under the new management. And if you think the Conservative government we just had was bad, how much worse could it have been if an elder god was in charge? And I carried on in that vein for a few books, and it's probably a good thing that I'm bringing that story arc of the series to a close now, because we have a non-Tory government, and the direction of travel for British politics is no longer obviously insane as it was. It's differently insane, but who knows? I need to lock it in at this point. This doesn't mean there won't be more books in the Laundryverse, but there won't be more in the original series that began with the Atrocity Archive. And starting out with Bob Howard as a fairly young, naive, eager computer geek who wanted to do field work because he was bored laying network cables. And ends up battling the animated skeleton ghost of King Arthur in the mall outside the Queen's funeral. As one does. And is increasingly jaded and cynical. Also, you have a problem with any long-running series, which is your protagonists tend to either keep repeating themselves or they level up and gain power and experience points until they're not really relatable anymore. I was running into problems with that with Bob. I tried introducing some new viewpoint protagonists along the way. You may have noticed how after book 5, it turned into a multi-viewpoint series rather than being all Bob all the time. And boy, did I find out which of my readers were Bob fans rather than laundry fans. But my attempt to spawn a spin-off series for new management kind of founded on COVID-19, which again, who ordered that? In that I was pitching to get Deadlines Dreaming positioned as the start of a whole new series, set sometime after the new management, set after the laundry. But it ran into the fact that my publishers all switched to lockdown and working from home, and nobody was talking to anybody, and it was impossible to go and do my authorial mind control on the marketing people and explain it's a different series. So we'll see how it goes.
I think we're the same age, and I guess we'd have grown up with the same things in terms of satire as well, things like Private Eye and Spitting Image and all that sort of stuff. Is there a sense, I've heard this from comedians, that things have gone to such an extent it's almost impossible to satirise anymore? I mean, I guess they don't have the advantage of throwing in some some tentacles or something like that.
What I found really horrific is that since 2020, people are reading the laundry files and stuff about the new management. There's some apparently an Aztec skull rack, think of an abacus full of human skulls, on Marble Arch, the site of the old Tyburn Gallows. And nevertheless, readers are reading the laundry files books as consolatory, happy, fun fantasy. Because the new management government is utterly, utterly evil. It's run by an elder god, but it's a competent evil. It's not Boris Johnson.
It's a bit like the fall of Stalinism, right? People were clamouring for Stalin to come back to restore order, I guess. There's something in people that want that certainty, maybe.
Yeah, the authoritarian instinct is the true horror show. It seems about 30% of the population everywhere are instinctive authoritarians who will vote for any baby-eating psychopathic monster as long as they promise stability. Consider the phenomenon of Trump. Consider the phenomenon of the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. Consider the phenomenon of Mussolini or Hitler. People like authoritarians who say that there is a very simple answer to every problem, and it's to obey them and pay no attention to the people being fed to the gas chambers behind them. It's always bullshit as well. Boris Johnson rode a wave of it in 2019 when he got elected by a landslide on a promise of get Brexit done. It's nice and simple. We have all the answers. Don't you worry about it. We'll just get rid of the whole problem and we can move forward. And it was a shit show, but unfortunately, that's how he did it. Again, this is a big problem with the US Republican Party, is they're making promises. They're writing checks they can't really cash, claiming to have solutions to everything, and they're not going to give you any details of it. In many cases, they're just pretending the problems don't exist. Climate change, that's a liberal myth.
Right, okay, we're just going to have to wrap this up in a moment. We've just got time for a quick question from the audience. So if anybody has a question for Mr. Stross, stick their hand up and I'll come down with the mic. Here we go, right here.
So are David Cameron and George Osborne particular heroes of yours? Heroes of yours.
Well, what can I say? I didn't vote for them, let's put it that way.
Has anybody else got a question? Yeah. Over there at that. Oh, no, I'll go that way. By exercise.
Thank you. Where did your horror of HR come from?
Do you really have to explain that? In the early 90s, I spent some years working for an American software multinational in London.
Enough said.
I got a dose of Californian HR. I should also add, because I was a technical author, I got trained in how to write American English for American readers, because they actually had a training manual for British technical authors working in that department, about 300 pages long, which came in very, very handy when I began selling novels to American publishers, because American publishers pay more because there's a bigger market there. That is why I'm actually able to make a living at this gig. But yeah, oh dear. It always seems to me that HR is a bit of a dead giveaway. If you think of the name, human resources, at least the old school term personnel
Anti-personnel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, yeah, one last one. Aha, here we go.
So the British government put out Threads in I think it was the 80s, which was the film about what would happen in a nuclear war. Did that feed into your Cold War stories at all, the grimmer stuff?
Yeah. Do I need to say any more about that? No. Okay, I grew up in Leeds. Leeds is in the middle, well, it's midway between Edinburgh and London, so pretty much in the middle of the UK. In fact, because they hadn't really visited the UK and just looked at it on a map, the Gestapo had tagged Quarry Hill Flats in Leeds as their headquarters for the UK after the invasion. It was grim enough. Leeds is at the top end of the M1 motorway, just 5 to 10 miles north of the midpoint of the M62 motorway between Liverpool and Hull. So if you've got a North Atlantic convoy coming in from the western approaches and delivering tanks or munitions to be shipped to a European theatre during World War III, they go through Leeds, or near enough. There was the largest tank factory in Western Europe, 5 miles up the road, the Vickers Tank Factory, where they made Chieftains and then Challengers. Leeds Bradford Airport, just off to one side, a major railway station, a canal. There were probably about 20 H-bombs pointed right at my house when I grew up. So this was a bit of an acute worry. Then when I went to university, I was in London. Do I need to say any more about that? So I felt kind of targeted.
Must be a reason for that.
So it was ubiquitous. I mean, the British government gave up on civil defence planning in about 1970. They completely gave up because they worked out that in event of a strategic nuclear exchange, the UK would get battered because we were closer than the United States. There's a lot of tactical warheads pointed at us. And the UK was an obvious resupply depot for NATO in Europe, with convoys of heavy equipment coming across the Atlantic for the UK. And by some estimates, in event of a nuclear exchange, 30% of the UK population would have been killed within the first 10 minutes. Another 30% would have died within the next month. And another 30% of the original population would have died over the next 6 months. Population would have been down to 10% after a year. And agriculture and transport would have completely collapsed. And this was back when we actually had some oil and some coal locally produced, and a railway network, and a strategic steam locomotive reserve. You may think I'm joking, but if you can pull steam locomotives out of storage, they can be refurbished and got working pretty much by brute force.
Yeah.
A lot of our modern infrastructure would simply not be there anymore.
Yeah.
So the prospects of doing anything after a nuclear war in the UK were grim. At one point, around 1996, I was doing some IT contract work for Hampshire County Council in a weird, huge-ass 1950s concrete building they built, full of, well, with a dinosaur pen full of mainframes in the basement and office space upstairs. And they had a plan for event of a nuclear war. Basically, sweep everything out through the windows, bodies, desks, computers, office furniture and all, and turn it into an emergency hospital of radiation sickness survivors. But that building was basically, it had been built to survive ground zero of a nuclear blast, but not for the contents to survive ground zero.
Just the building. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
Well, here's Tom with the weather.
And can I add one very last thought, in case all of that is a bit too much of a downer, it turns out Russia has had 6 consecutive test failures for their latest ICBM in the past year. They keep trying to launch them, they keep exploding the silo or failing. So it's not all bad news.
And Innsmouth does have an invisible protective dome over it, so be assured we're quite safe. We're quite safe. So I've been told.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. Well, thanks very much for joining us today, Charlie. It's been very interesting talking. There's loads more things we can talk about, I'm sure. But
It's been a pleasure to be here.
yeah, ladies and gentlemen, Charlie.